Welcome, everyone. I am Celeste Brecht, and I'm here today with Susan Goldberg to present a fireside chat with Susan Goldberg, who's the editor-in-chief of National Geographic. I'm a partner at Venable and co-chair of the West Coast Litigation Group, and am hosting today's program through WAVE. WAVE is the women attorneys at Venable, and our mission is a recognition that women's professional success requires professional development and a strong, sustainable practice that contributes to the economic success of a firm or business. And we try to help promote that with interesting events that are focused on promoting this women and the advancement of our profession. Today, we're advancing our mission with our special speaker, Susan Goldberg, who again is the editor-in-chief of National Geographic. And earlier this year, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, WAVE started a hashtag Women Who Inspire campaign. The purpose of this is to start these conversations and have conversations with people like Susan, who are truly inspirational, and recognizing women who have come to provide all of us with inspiration to continue on. So there's truly no one better than Susan Goldberg to have this event with. Just taking a step back and talking a little bit about Susan. She's the first woman to hold the position of editor-in-chief of National Geographic, and the magazine has been around since 1888. So it's been a long time coming, but we're happy to have you here with us. Under Susan's leadership, National Geographic has won 5 National Magazine Awards and has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Susan and I share one small thing. We're both Michigan natives for background, but in reviewing all of your many accomplishments, I think my personal favorite is the recognition you received from InStyle magazine as being one of the top 50 badass women who are changing the world. So that's pretty special. Today, we'd like to talk a little bit about your career as a journalist, how journalism, and specifically photographic journalism, has shaped and influenced women's lives throughout the world. And as part of that, we're going to talk about your fabulous book, and I highly recommend everyone to spend the $50 on Amazon and get a copy of this Women, which is a collection of photographs of women from the archives of National Geographic spanning 130 years. So what we'd like to do now is turn it over to you to give us a highlight of some of the images in the book, and then we can shift to actually engaging in how you went about this book and some of the other topics for today. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who's attending.
Well, thank you, Celeste, for inviting me, and thanks to the women at Venable for hosting this event. I'm really honored to be here. When you asked me to come here, I thought I would start off with one fact and then one photo. And the fact, as you mentioned, Celeste, is that I am the first woman to become the editor-in-chief of National Geographic. And the math really works out like this. So National Geographic's been around for 132 years. I've been there for 7 years, so it did take them 125 years to find a woman for the job. And then the photo I like to look at is this one. And, this pretty much says everything you need to say about how long it took for a woman to get this job. This is me and all of the 9 men who preceded me in my role. And, I look at this sometimes and I have a variety of reactions. I first can hardly believe my good fortune to have this job. But sometimes I look at it and I get a little bit depressed because it just tells you how long it can take, for women to break through and succeed. But, sometimes I look at it and I just laugh because it reminds me of what they say on Sesame Street, which is one of these things is not like the other. But mostly when I see this picture, what I am reminded of and what we think about so much at National Geographic is the power of visual storytelling. I mean, you look at this and you know the backstory here. You do not need to read one word. And we think about that all the time because we know that at National Geographic, more than anywhere else, the use of images can really change perceptions. And this is particularly true when we talk about the representation of underrepresented groups or marginalized groups, too often women and people of color. So you mentioned the book, and I am delighted to show some images from that book today. As you said, we started it because this is a moment of true female empowerment and also the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in the United States. We also created, along with the book, a special issue of the magazine. This came out in November of 19, and it is the first issue in our history produced and completely done by women, all female writers, all female illustrators, and all female photographers. And so I was so delighted to be able to share these two things with our readers and now with you, because when you look at how women have been depicted over 3 centuries, the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, you see this huge, huge arc of change. And I'd love just to take you through some of that. This is an important picture, and we don't know much about it. On the back of this picture that comes out of our archives, all it says is 1896, photographer unknown, Zulu bride and bridegroom. And the reason this picture is important is it is the first time that a woman is the subject of a photo in National Geographic. So this is where it starts in 1896. Then we've got this long period of pictures of women sort of as beautiful objects, such as this lovely picture from 1932. We have many years of photos of women seen in just very, very traditional roles. This picture is from 1939 in Appalachia. You know, then we get a long period of very hilariously smiley photographs of women almost used as props to show off themselves or products, like this woman holding a flying fish. This photo is from the late 1940s, and this goes into the 50s. And I'm showing you this cover because this is from 1959, the year I was born, and it is the first time a woman was pictured on the cover of National Geographic. And what is kind of ironic and sad about this is that this is a purely decorative photo. It is a colorized photo. This woman is so unimportant that we don't even know her name. But things do start to change. This is from 1964, and this is a picture of a woman named Rhoda Brooks, and she is the first woman that we ever showed doing a job. She is a Peace Corps volunteer, and this is taken in Bolivia. So finally, we have a woman who is actually working, featured in National Geographic. And before long, we start getting just not decorative photos, but photos of women with real emotion. This is a picture from Bulgaria. It's from 1978, and this woman is mourning the death of her son by murder. We have rage. I mean, these amazing emotions. Finally, women are taking part in this. This is from 1982 in Jerusalem. And we're seeing women succeeding in all kinds of ways we had not seen them succeed before. This is Jane Goodall from the mid-60s. We're seeing women pictured as laborers, such as these women hauling bricks in India in 1980. Or this beautiful image of a female gamekeeper from Kenya just a few years ago, taken by one of our wildlife photographers named Amy Vitale. We're seeing women being truly successful. Here is this thriving, striving, beautiful young woman graduating from Spelman College in 2018, her and her family, her very proud family. And this is astronaut Peggy Whitson. She was on our cover in in 2019, Peggy Whitson holds the U.S. record for the longest cumulative amount of time in space for any U.S. astronaut. We looked at the lives of women as children, and this is probably the most famous cover we have ever produced. It is commonly referred to as Afghan Girl, taken by Steve McCurry in 1985. And this was such an important cover, not only because of the iconic image, but because of how much it did to draw people's attention to the plight of refugees. You know, I think it's very important that we shine a spotlight on the lives of women in all kinds of circumstances, including really difficult ones. This is a picture taken in Sierra Leone just a couple of years ago. It shows a 17-year-old girl named Baby Sabure, and she is pictured here with her own child and her 48-year-old husband. And I think it's very important that we as National Geographic, shine our photographs on the lives of women who are not as lucky as any of us are, because these women are truly oppressed, and the lives of the oppressed can become invisible, and their voices will not be heard at all unless we can try to make that more clear. We also looked at women who are really non-traditional. In 2017, we did an issue about gender, and we didn't just look at gender as a binary, but we looked at gender on a gender spectrum. And this is how we ended up meeting Avery Jackson, a 9-year-old transgender girl from Kansas City, Missouri. And, this cover, I think, is one of the most important that certainly I've done in my tenure. I will tell you, not all of our readers appreciated this cover. About 10,000 of them canceled their subscriptions to the magazine. They found it offensive. But I will tell you that out of all the things that I've done in my 40-year career, this cover has been one of the most important to me. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me to tell me that because we put a transgender person on the cover of National Geographic, it allowed people to have conversations in their own families that they never could have before. So I was, very honored by that. As part of our book, I had such a privilege of speaking to about 25 of the most amazing women in the world. And I asked them all the same 11 questions. And this really brings us right into today. I asked them what needed to change for women to really have an even playing field with men. And I also asked them about some of the hurdles that they themselves had gotten over. I'd like to share some of their answers with you. I talked to Jacinta Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who very shortly after this picture was taken became very well known when 50 people were killed in a mosque there, and because of her incredible reaction to ban guns in New Zealand. And when I talked to her, what she told me when I asked what was her biggest hurdle, she said, "Myself. I am my own biggest hurdle. No one will be a bigger critic of me than me. I think many women are much harsher on themselves and on their abilities. I'm one of them." And I asked Oprah Winfrey, what was your biggest hurdle? And she answered immediately. She said, "Pleasing other people, the disease to please. It's our curse, and it happens when we are raised to not know our own value or our own worth." Now, this is a picture of Jennifer Doudna. Jennifer invented a gene editing technique called CRISPR. It is one of the major scientific breakthroughs of the last 100 years. And yet, Jennifer shared with me all of the doubts that she had growing up about her own ability to become a scientist. She said, "I always asked myself, can I really become a biochemist and be a successful scientist?" And she said, "There were a number of times when I was younger when I thought the answer was no." Now, on the other hand, these women also had a lot in common when they talked about the advice that they give to younger women. Jennifer Doudna, still on our screen here, she said, her advice to younger women now is walk into a room like you own the place. A man would do that without compunction. Now, this is Roxane Gay. Roxane is a best-selling author who writes about the intersection of race, gender, and pop culture. And she's weathered a lot of abuse from trolls because of her body type and because she's an African-American woman who's a bisexual. And, I will tell you, she doesn't take any of that. And what she said was, young women have to be able to stand up for themselves and advocate for themselves without fear. It's important for young women to embrace their ambition, to know their worth, and to ask for it. And finally, and this feels so current with what's going on right now, I talked to Alicia Garza, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And I just loved her quote. She said, "My greatest strength is my ability to ignore it when I get no for an answer. When people say it cannot be done, there's something that goes off inside and just says, watch me." So I started out with a picture that I have in my office of myself and the 9 men who preceded me. And I want to end with another picture that hangs on my office wall. And I have it there for the pure inspiration of it. This is Gabrielle Greene. She is in the Marine Corps, and she is training for deployment. And as you can see, she has slung a 200-pound man over her shoulder, and she is marching up a steep ramp. And what it says on her thighs, that tattoo, it says, "The fire inside me burns brighter than the fire around me." So every day when I go into my office, when I used to go into my office now before I started working from home, I just look at this picture, and from it, I draw so much inspiration about her attitude, about her resilience, about her courage, about her ability to literally lift people up. I mean, you can see that she is not going to drop that guy and that she is going to get where she's going. And so, I think about the power of imagery, and I look at this image every day taken by Lindsey A Dario, one of the world's great conflict photographers, and I just feel really inspired. And so that is just a little snapshot and a high-speed tour through some of the pictures that you found in our women's book and in our magazine, and the lessons that I learned from them.
Thank you so much. I mean, it truly seems like a task with so many photos to choose from that, is something that I'm sure was difficult. And I'm curious as to your kind of criteria for inclusion in the book and how many photos you wished you could have included if the book had no size limit.
Well, this book has 450 images. It has 512 pages, and it weighs 6 pounds. So it's already a really big book. I will tell you, though, this was a very tough task, and we had a group of people, book editors and photo editors, who made these selections. We have 64 million digital and print images in National Geographic archives. So you can see how huge it is. Certainly not all of those images are of women, but a lot of them were. We were doing okay until we got down to about the last 700 photos, and then it just became kind of a fight. But what we were looking for were images that could tell how much the roles of women had changed. And I should have mentioned this before. I mean, not only do you see this sort of narrative arc on the changing role of women, but one of the reasons you see that is not just because women are doing different things than they used to do, but because of who is taking the pictures. We have a lot more female photographers at National Geographic now. And I think it's fair to say not only do they see the world in different ways than men do, but they have access to women in a way that men often don't. So I think we tried to find both beautiful pictures, but pictures that would tell this story of this arc of change.
And that leads to my next question perfectly, which is, as part of either the selection for the book or just what you've observed over time in your career, how have you observed the photographs changing as between the male and female photographers?
Well, sometimes it's literally about whether men can even get in the room. For example, when we take pictures in places like Saudi Arabia, you cannot be a man, anywhere near a woman that you're not married to. And so when we went to do a story about the changing role of women in Saudi Arabia, we sent a female writer and a female photographer because it was the only way we could really engage with them. But I do think that both women writers and women photographers end up seeing the world in different ways. All of us come to our jobs and how we approach them because carrying both the baggage and the and the wonderful things about who we are. So I've always thought it's one of the main reasons to have a really diverse staff because, myself, I'm a 60-year-old white woman who grew up in the Midwest. So I, have a worldview that is certainly informed by that. That is going to be a different worldview from, say, a young African-American man or an Indo-American woman. And that's why we need a diverse staff of writers, photographers, and editors. If we're going to cover a diverse world in an authentic and credible way, we need a staff that can help us see different things as stories than any one of us alone might be able to see.
And what interested you in photographic journalism kind of from the beginning? Like, how is it, if you could just give a, thumbnail sketch of how you went from, being a young person in Michigan to being where you are now as editor-in-chief of National Geographic?
Well, it took a long time. But, I started out really on the word side. I always wanted to be a reporter. And that is, in fact, what I did in the beginning. It's really kind of a surprise that I ended up at National Geographic because I did come up that word side and not the photo side at all. But, I started wanting to be a journalist when I was growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And there were these incredible student protests going on. So this is the 1960s, protests over the Vietnam War. And every night we would sit down as a family at dinner and watch the evening news. And you could see how the journalists were telling the truth about what was going on in Vietnam through their words and through their photographs, and how much the administration was covering that up and lying about what was going on. And it made me understand the power of journalism to, shine that light into those dark corners and to, expose bad things. To shine a light, I think, is important on, you shine that light on bad things so they can be fixed, and you shine that light on good things so they can be celebrated. And it just made me want to be a reporter. And so that's what I started out doing. I worked as a reporter at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and I was a reporter at the Detroit Free Press. Became an editor there, went to the San Jose Mercury News, kind of rose up the ranks there, ended up the editor there. I was the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I was a top editor at USA Today. I was a top editor at Bloomberg News. And then one day the phone rang and it was National Geographic saying, "Are you interested in coming here?" And I said, "Heck yes." And that's how I ended up at National Geographic.
That's amazing. And did you have any kind of, not self-doubt, but just question as to whether you could do the National Geographic job, which is, deeply dependent on photography, when you had a background and experience that was not necessarily in that field?
I had more questions, not so much about photos, but about working for what originally, of course, was a monthly magazine, because, I came out of a daily journalism background. And when I worked for Bloomberg, even, which is a digital only journalism outfit, we would measure things in the seconds. Did we beat Reuters by a second? And if you didn't, you kind of got into trouble. But so I was a little bit worried that I would find the pace slow at National Geographic. But the truth of it is that by the time I got to National Geographic, not only, of course, was it a monthly magazine, but, we have a website. We have the world's biggest, we're the biggest brand in the world on Instagram. We have a podcast. I mean, we are telling stories across all of our platforms now, and doing daily content in real time, which I don't think I could have gone to a monthly magazine were it only a monthly magazine. But now more and more, wherever it is that you work in the media business, you're producing more of the same kinds of you're not doing the same kinds of stories, but the cadence of that content is more and more the same because of the expectation of the public that it wants news and information when it wants to have it on the platform on which it wants to have it.
And have you personally seen a transformation in representation at different news outlets, media outlets, and the places that you've worked over time to be more balanced and inclusive?
I mean, this is one of the toughest things that we deal with every single day at National Geographic, and I would say it's one of the most important and toughest issues going on in media, which is, how are we representing people? Are we doing this correctly? We did an issue on race a couple of years ago. In 2018, we did it on the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King Jr., and it seemed like a good time to take stock of where we were with race relations in our country. It turned out to be a little bit prescient that way. But one of the things that we had to do at National Geographic, I thought, was if we were going to talk about race issues, we had to look at how we had represented race over the years. And so I asked a photographic historian at the University of Virginia, to come help and to look through those gigantic archives. And, what he found was very sobering. It was pretty much that up until the 1970s, if you were a person of color in the United States, you were not pictured in National Geographic unless you were seen as perhaps a laborer or a domestic help of some kind. There just weren't pictures of Black and brown people in the U.S. in National Geographic. And too often when we went overseas, the pictures were exoticized. And, it really was an important thing for us to come to terms with, I thought, before we could really talk about race. And so now, we are very, very careful, which is not to say we don't make mistakes and that others make mistakes in representation, but we are always talking about it and we are very aware. And again, this is when having that diverse staff is so important, where we've got photographers who are people of color or who are from the countries in which we are taking those pictures. So we're not just parachuting in, as these white people and, taking pictures that really might not be the most authentic kind of picture to take. But it's very tough. And you never want to get to where only white people can take pictures of white people and only Black people can take pictures of Black people. I don't think that's the right place to be at all. But it's a struggle, and it's something we talk about a lot.
And as being the person who's at the helm, do you have any tips, because we're all kind of struggling with this, of, how do you recruit, retain, promote, train diverse backgrounds within all professions? Is that something, especially in, this medium of representation and, ultimately wanting a work product or a magazine or the content that you're producing to be reflective and inclusive, how do you help create a more inclusive and diverse staff to help produce those images? What have you found that, works?
Yeah, I think first you have to know where you are, right? So we count. And I just was counting bylines the other day for the magazine. Of course, I count in the magazine, I count across our digital platforms, I look at what photographers we're hiring. But I'll give you an example. I just counted these bylines, so it's in my head. In 1966, for example, 93% of the stories done in National Geographic magazine that year, 93% were men, and I can assure you they were all white men. So hardly any women at all. In 2015, the year after I got to National Geographic, that figure was still 76% white men. In the first 6 months of this year, January to June, in the magazine itself, it was 36% men, writers. And so, I think probably by the end of the year, it'll be closer to 50-50, but you can really see. And so I think the first thing is to know where you are, because if you don't know what the truth is of your numbers and of who is doing the work for you, then you can't really fix the problem. Then I just think you need to be looking at every single hiring decision, whether that is a permanent hire onto our permanent staff or it is a freelance hire. The majority of stories, both on our website and in our magazine, and the vast majority of our pictures are taken by contract photographers or writers who we work with. So you can make change quicker there if you're working with contractors. But you've got to think about it every single time. Our content costs a lot to produce. And so I understand there is this desire to always go back to the same people who have done the work successfully for us in the past. But if we don't take some chances on some new people, we're never going to get different results. And I think we have made a very concerted effort, certainly in the last 4 and 5 years, to really broaden that circle of who are our regular contributors and how do we make sure it is a much more diverse group. And the same, of course, goes for every staff hire. It's a person-by-person battle to end up where you need to get. It's really hard.
And I mean, the statistics and the arc that you've just kind of described in your tenure are very impressive. Have you had to deal with any pushback from people who maybe feel like, they're now disadvantaged? And how do you deal with that, if so?
I think that initially, there was, for instance, when I started talking with our photo staff about why about 85% of our pictures when I first got there were taken by white male photographers. Initially, the answers were because there aren't women who who do natural history photography. And while it is true that there are not as many women who do, natural history photography, you can set out to find them. And we have, there's still differences for whatever reason. There are a lot more women who are conflict photographers than who are natural history photographers. There are very, very few women that we have found who do underwater photography at the level of photography that we're looking for. But we are looking really hard, and we've tried to create programs to help train women in those areas where there are legitimately shortages. We have something now called the Second Assistant Program. Most of our photographers in the field go with an assistant. Now we try to get them to go with a second assistant who is a woman or a person from a diverse background who can start to learn this craft and learn from these incredibly talented folks doing that work in hopes that they then will become that next generation of more diverse photographers. So I think we can do things like that, but none of it is going to happen by accident. It has to be completely intentional.
And what do you think,
Celeste?
Yes.
I didn't actually answer your question. Your question was about pushback. And so I would say that initially when I first got there was that we can't find any. Now I think that there is really an embracing and an understanding that if we're going to be credible purveyors of information, we really do need this diversity. So I think quite opposite from the pushback, especially in this next generation of writers, editors, photographers. We see a real embracing of the need for diversity. So I'm sorry, I had not answered that question.
Well, and it sounds like you've been able to, through the work product and maybe the results of going out and finding these people who maybe weren't or were being overlooked before, have been able to create consensus and buy-in to that approach. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. Look, maybe there are a couple of angry people somewhere, but I don't hear from them, and so that's fine.
Good. So turning to one of your questions, what do you think the biggest hurdle to advancement of women within your profession has been?
I always think equal pay is it just comes right down to it. I think this is a gigantic problem, and it hasn't been solved. I hope it will be solved in the next few years. But throughout my 40-year career, I know that there were men in the same positions who made a lot more money than me, and I don't think I was as good of an advocate for myself as I could have been. I think women often, maybe women my age were made to feel very awkward to even talk about money. I guess it's not easy for anybody, but you were just not a nice person if you really pushed back about money. And I think we kind of need to collectively get over that. And that is one area where women do need to act a lot more like men, who don't seem shy about it at all. I'm sure it might make a lot of men uncomfortable as well, but they get over it, and I think we need to get over it.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any kind of tips to people coming up within any profession who are women or of a diverse background as to how to kind of break in and succeed in a professional environment?
I mean, I think my tips really for women or people of color would be my tips for really anybody trying to break in, which is, fill a vacuum, don't be on the sidelines, raise your hand, volunteer, get involved, speak up, do all of those things, even if it's really hard for you to do that, because, mostly people aren't going to come over and tap you on the arm and say, give me your thoughts. You're going to have to be bold enough at some point to put your thoughts forward. And you've got to, doing that, have to be able to also handle rejection and be resilient and keep coming forward. Keep being like Gabrielle Greene, walking up that ramp with that 200-pound guy over your shoulder. You just have to, every Tuesday, keep trying anew. And I think that the quality of resiliency has helped me enormously in my career. Like everybody else, I have good days and bad days, but that bad day never is going to lead to a second bad day in a row. I'll be darned if it will.
And do you have any kind of recommended, in addition to everyone should purchase and read Women if they're looking for inspiration or kind of those tips for when you have a bad day, how you get back up. But in addition to the Women book, what kind of works of literature, television shows, movies, what types of things do you draw on for inspiration as to how to get back in it when you feel like, ugh, I really don't feel like doing that today? To the extent you have, maybe you don't never have those days, but to the extent you do, what's your kind of go-to?
I don't know if I really have a go-to. I mean, I like taking walks in the morning. That really helps me, particularly now that we're all cooped up at home and, not really going anywhere. I have never felt so homebound, and I find, a change of scenery or looking at new things or wandering around in new neighborhoods has helped me enormously. One thing I like doing I like to cook. And so sometimes I find chopping up vegetables in extremely small pieces is very helpful. But I guess I don't really read books necessarily for inspiration. I love nonfiction. I think when they asked me before this talk, what who inspired me, I mentioned Katharine Graham, and she has a biography called Personal History, and an autobiography. And I thought, and I still think, it's one of the most inspirational, incredible books I have ever read about a woman's journey. She starts off, of course, she inherited a newspaper, but she starts off shy and so full of doubt and so awkward, and just ends up this amazing powerhouse. I mean, talk about a badass, right? She's, the original badass as far as I'm concerned. And I love that story, but I can't tell you I think about it every day. I probably should.
What's something that you've done within your career that you would say you're most proud of?
I'm really proud of some of the harder stories that I've been involved in, whether it was when I was the editor of the Plain Dealer in Cleveland, doing stories about the incredible corruption at the highest levels of government in Cuyahoga County. Our coverage and FBI indictments helped lead to voters to completely throw out all of those criminals and bring in a new government. I mean, I feel incredibly proud of work that makes change. I feel really proud, as I mentioned, of that, cover that had a transgender person on the cover of National Geographic. I feel proud of the fact that, we owned our own not very good history about race at National Geographic. I mean, it's always the hard things, right, that you end up being the most proud of, not those simple, easy things. It's those hard things that you learn from and that make you stronger.
And then in thinking about race and diversity and inclusion and connection with race, do you have any suggested resources or kind of things that you did to help educate yourself in, taking a hard look at National Geographic's past and then kind of what you wanted to do to change that going forward?
I mean, I think there needs to be, you have to know what you don't know, right? And I felt like for us to tell this story of ourselves properly, looking back at the history of National Geographic, it couldn't be an inside job. I needed to bring in an outsider to comb through those archives and to give me his professional opinion. And then I needed to tell that story. So I think knowing all the things you don't know and not being afraid to ask for help from people who know a lot more of it. And sometimes that is talking to diverse colleagues, or sometimes that's reading something or going to the experts, but to not assume that you've got all the answers here, because we really don't. I mean, one of the things that we're needing to do now is figure out, how do we cover these protests going on, right? We've been covering the human journey for 132 years at National Geographic. And how do we cover the protests, and how do we cover sort of this conversation going on about race in the United States and to some extent around the world? And, there's nothing more humbling than, listening to, your colleagues, diverse people of color talking about this and realizing just how much you don't know or that you've been blind to. And you've got to be willing to accept that, I think, before you can go forward in an authentic and legitimate way.
Now I see there are some questions that are coming through. So I'm going to turn, since we're coming up, to the last 10 minutes or so, as to what some of the audience questions are. So I'm not dominating all of this. So one, as a woman from the Midwest, how did you educate yourself to diversity of cultures covered in National Geographic? So it sounds like in part it was bringing in somebody from the outside to help, but were there any other, steps that you took?
Well, I mean, I was very lucky as a kid. Growing up in Ann Arbor, my parents were both with the University of Michigan, and we traveled. We didn't have tons of money, but my dad went on sabbaticals. He was a professor, and we went on sabbaticals all over the world. And any money that my family did have seemed to put it toward traveling around the world. And so, I was always fascinated by other places, other cultures, things I didn't know. I think I'm a curious person, which is probably one of the most important characteristics of for a journalist to have. But I also read National Geographic when I was a kid, and of course, saw all these amazing, amazing places. So I think it was just sort of a slow education of a curious person who's gotten to see more and more of the world.
And what's the most fun or unusual thing that you've had the chance to do while you've been at National Geographic?
Oh my gosh, so many. I don't know. I've been, we have these incredible trips. When we start having them again, you can consider this an advertisement. We have private jet trips around the world. I've gotten to go on some of those where you literally go around the world on your own jet. It's pretty amazing. I have gotten to recently, we took a trip to Antarctica, another National Geographic trip, and wandered around with, in these penguin colonies. I've swum with seals and penguins in Galapagos. I mean, I just feel like being at National Geographic has been an incredible education in seeing the world and in seeing the natural world. But I would have to say, out of all of the amazing trips I've been on, probably Antarctica and the Galapagos in their own way were the most epic.
Well, if you need a second assistant for a future Galapagos trip, I'm officially volunteering myself and applying here.
There you go. I love that.
So what advice would you give to yourself starting out your career now? I'll steal an Oprah. I think this is one of Oprah's favorite questions. But what would you tell the 20-year-old Susan Goldberg?
Oh, I think a lot of people give this advice to their younger self, to not be so hard on themselves. It's sort of like what Jacinta Ardern said, that she was her own worst critic. And I feel like that is certainly true for me. So my advice, not to be so hard on myself, not to care so much about everybody else's opinion about how I looked, what I said, what I did, and to, I don't know, just to have a little more throw back your shoulders kind of confidence, more a little bit fake it till you make it. I think that's always good advice.
And what do you see for yourself in the next decade, let's say? Like, what would you hope, yes, that where you see yourself 10 years from now and kind of what you would like to do with National Geographic in that time?
Well, I would be the luckiest person in the world to work at National Geographic for the next 10 years. I would guess that probably won't happen. I am 60, as I mentioned. I would really like this to be my last, journalism job, if that's possible. And then I don't know what I'd want to do. I've thought about maybe running a journalism school or working for a cause that I might believe in. But I haven't really given it a lot of thought past about the next 4 or 5 years, but I really love what I'm doing at National Geographic. And one of the things I love is that this is such a changing time in media that it is never the same, and it is incredibly challenging. It is challenging from a financial point of view because, the normal ways in which we were funded, like advertising, have completely gone out the window. But we're getting to invent how to tell stories to this next generation of readers and users. And so being part of that and being able to then ultimately hand that off to somebody in that next generation, nothing would make me happier.
Okay. Let's see. One other question we've received from the audience. What kind of books or magazines have you read recently that have impacted your worldview or perspective, especially in light of current situations?
Well, I'm in the middle of reading Educated, which is just an incredible book. I might be the last person in America to have read it, but about this woman's journey, and it is so inspirational. I really read with great attention the New York Times 1619 project, looking back at 400 years, looking back 400 years to the time when slavery started. And I think that project is incredibly important, and it proved, I think, very, very crucial for people to be cognizant of now. Is I think there will be a national discussion around reparations, and so people really understanding what is the beginning, what is the original sin, how does it start, and what has it meant, and how has that played out these 401 years since then. I think that's a really important thing for all of us to get our arms around and to really feel steeped in.
Okay, now I have a series of kind of quick Q&As that we can end on that should be fun, but, that's the premise. So, okay. Living or dead, who's the one person you would most like to have dinner with?
Maya Angelou.
Okay. What have you enjoyed most about life in quarantine, if anything?
Cooking, just endless cooking.
And endless eating?
Unfortunately, endless eating.
Yeah. And what have you found to be most challenging about life in quarantine?
Boredom. Isolation. I miss my colleagues. There's so many things.
When you're editing something, are you a track changes or hard copy editor?
Oh, no, both. I've been editing, on computers really since the beginning of my career, as soon as my typewriter went away. But I do both.
Who's your favorite Venable attorney? For those who maybe don't know your special connection to Venable.
Well, Jeffrey Etnier, of course.
And who is he?
He's my husband.
Now, have you, I'm assuming Jeff has been very supportive throughout your career. Do you find that that's an important piece of being able to do what you've been able to do?
I actually think that's huge. It might be the only thing that I agree with Sheryl Sandberg on. Who you choose as your spouse couldn't be more important to your success in your career. My husband is the most supportive spouse ever, and not just supportive. When we go on these trips, he is he'll go talk to the most boring person in the room over and over and over again, so I don't have to. It's just so amazing. And, he has always made the time, and even on at times when it should have been his special day. Like on his 60th birthday, when he came to a dinner with me when I was the editor of the Plain Dealer for the Lieutenant Governor of Ohio. Not even the governor of Ohio, the Lieutenant Governor of Ohio. And I had to go to this dinner, and it was his 60th birthday. And he was cheerful. And if you ask him to this day, he's always like, that was a really good dinner. I'm like, are you nuts? But anyway, so that's my husband.
Good. All right. So I think for our final words, what advice would you give to this next generation of female leaders who are coming up?
Grab the brass ring.
All right. Well, with that, I would like to thank you and thank everybody who's attended our group. And if we don't have any kind of final words or comments other than those, I will just end with, again, just because this is not, I'm not getting a commission on this, but I will say I've spent and have lost, hours into this book because it really is a nice kind of escape from everything. And, there's definitely inspiration here. So thank you so much for all of the work that you've done. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And thanks to everybody who's attended this program for joining.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.